Rain slapped against the diner windows as if trying to break through, and the door swung open with the kind of force that made every head turn. That was when Ethan Ward walked in, soaked from his shoulders to his shoes, carrying the same sharp glare he took into boardrooms where billions moved with a single sentence. It was strange enough to see a man like him in a small place like this, and even stranger to see him order the cheapest meal on the menu without even looking at it. His voice low and tense, like he was trying to hide the storm inside him. It created the kind of moment that makes people wonder what happened before he stepped into the room and why someone dressed in such expensive clothes would settle for the smallest thing he could buy. Grace noticed the chill coming off him long before the cold air did, handing him a clean towel without hesitation, not reacting to his harsh mood or the water dripping from his sleeves. That simple gesture, soft and unexpected, cut through the tension just enough to plant the feeling that something deeper was happening beneath his scowl. It raised the quiet questions that float between strangers on nights like this, the kind that make a person look twice and wonder who exactly just walked through the door and what weight he was carrying that made him look so worn and angry. Ethan sat there staring at the menu like it was a report he had already memorized, though he had no intention of ordering more. His mind drifted back to his skyscraper, the glass walls, the empty office overlooking a city he controlled more on paper than in spirit. Numbers were the only voices he listened to, the only ones that mattered. For years he convinced himself emotions were liabilities, softness was a weakness, and the only path forward in life was paved with logic and profit. That belief shaped everything around him, from the way he managed his company to the way he moved through the world, guarded and unreachable. Yet as he sat inside that tiny diner, shivering from the rain still rolling down his neck, Grace's quiet attentiveness created a strange contrast he couldn't ignore. She moved around the room with a gentle rhythm, checking on each customer with genuine care rather than obligation, and every small action made Ethan feel the weight of his own emptiness. It wasn't that he wanted connection. He told himself he had no need for it, but the warmth inside the diner only made the coldness inside him stand out more sharply. He tried to pretend her kindness didn't bother him, that it didn't slip past the walls he built, but a heavy pull formed in his chest, as if something long ignored had finally woken up. And with that feeling came the uncomfortable curiosity about why her presence pushed so hard against the rigid world he lived in. Grace returned with a quiet smile and gently lifted his half-empty cup, replacing it with fresh, steaming coffee before he could say a word. When he glanced up in confusion, she said softly that hot drinks shouldn't be left cold on nights like this. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know the worth of the watch on his wrist or the empire tied to his last name. To her, he was just a soaked man trying to get warm. That small truth unsettled him more than he expected. He watched her greet an older couple with patience, offer a free refill to a truck driver, and hand a takeout bag to a mother wrangling two tired kids. She moved as if compassion was natural, not something you had to earn, and something about that made his inner defenses shake. Ethan had spent years believing value was measured by contribution, efficiency, and output. Dignity was something that came from results. Yet here he was, sitting in a cheap diner receiving more genuine care than he ever felt in his entire penthouse life. His facade slipped just for a moment, revealing confusion at the tenderness in her gesture, and he felt something tightening in his throat, something he tried to swallow but couldn't. His heartbeat grew heavy with the strange thought that maybe he had been missing something vital, something he never allowed himself to see. And that small crack became the start of the conflict rising inside him, making him wonder why an act so tiny touched him more than all the luxury he built around himself. Unable to fight the question burning in his chest, Ethan finally asked Grace why she bothered being kind to someone who ordered the smallest, cheapest thing on the menu. She didn't hesitate, didn't blush, didn't treat the question like an attack. She simply said that everyone deserves to feel human, especially on nights when life feels heavier than usual. Her words reached him deeper than he cared to admit, settling in places of his mind he always shut off. He realized nothing about his own company reflected the kind of dignity she offered so easily, and the realization hit him hard enough to leave him staring into his coffee without tasting it. His entire belief system felt suddenly fragile, as if a single voice had finally spoken the truth he avoided for years. The storm outside didn't compare to the one building inside him. Grace moved away to help another customer, unaware of the shift she had caused, while Ethan sank into a quiet battle with himself. Everything he built was rooted in the idea that kindness was optional, softness was unnecessary, and efficiency was the only measure of value. Now that idea felt thin and hollow. He felt a pressure rising in his chest, a pull toward something unfamiliar, and he couldn't stop thinking that if a small moment like this could shake him so deeply, maybe the foundation of his life wasn't as strong as he believed. And that thought pushed him toward a decision he didn't yet understand but couldn't avoid. When Ethan stepped back out into the storm, the rain didn't feel as harsh as before, but his thoughts were louder than the thunder above him. He walked through the night replaying Grace's words until they formed a quiet echo that refused to fade. By the time he reached his car, he realized he couldn't let the moment end inside that diner. Something in him needed to know why her kindness mattered so much, why her presence made him question everything he built. The next morning, before the sun rose over the skyline, Ethan drafted a formal invitation, short but respectful, asking Grace to meet him in his tower office. He didn't explain the reason, because he barely understood it himself, yet he knew it was a step he couldn't take back. When Grace received the message hours later, her breath caught in her chest, shock and uncertainty mixing with the memory of the quiet man in the corner booth. She wondered what he could possibly want from someone like her. Ethan, meanwhile, stood in his office with a strange knot in his stomach, aware that this decision would change the path of both their lives. And as the city woke around him, one question hung in the air between their two very different worlds. Why would a billionaire summon a waitress? And what truth was he about to uncover? Before we jump in, take a second and pause the video to tell us in the comments where you're listening from today and whether you've ever walked into a place feeling out of place the way Grace is about to. Go ahead and drop it there so we can keep going, because this moment between them only makes sense when we share our own stories too. Grace stepped out of the elevator with her hands slightly trembling, even though she kept them hidden inside her coat pockets, trying to breathe steady as she entered the quiet hallway that led to Ethan's office. She had barely slept, replaying every second from the diner in her mind, wondering why a man with his kind of money and power would want to speak with her again. When the assistant waved her inside, Grace caught sight of him standing by the window with the city spread out behind him, looking just as pressed and polished as she imagined someone like him always did. He turned toward her with a softer expression than she remembered, almost like he wasn't sure how to begin. He thanked her for coming, his voice low but sincere, and explained that he wanted to understand something he had never been able to grasp on his own. He talked about the way she treated him without judgment, and how that small act kept him thinking all night, how it made him question the core of how he ran his company. Grace listened with her heart beating too fast, unsure how to react to a billionaire opening up to her like he owed her something important. He asked her to sit, and she did, trying to stay composed even though her nerves felt like they were buzzing under her skin. He explained that his company had grown in ways he never imagined, but somewhere along the way he lost sight of the real people behind the numbers. He admitted it openly, something she didn't expect from a man who carried so much authority. He said he wanted her perspective, not as an expert, but as someone who understood dignity in a way he realized he didn't. She hesitated because it felt like too big a request for someone like her, and she wondered if he understood the weight of what he was asking. Grace had never stepped into a world like this, and she didn't want to become part of something she didn't believe in. Still, she couldn't ignore the gratitude in his eyes, a look that told her he meant every word, even if he didn't fully know what he was doing. Ethan noticed her hesitation and leaned forward slightly, assuring her that he wasn't asking for anything complicated, just honesty and the courage to say things he needed to hear from someone who saw life from the ground level instead of the top floor. Grace finally spoke, her voice steadier than she expected, saying she didn't know if she was the right person for something that sounded so serious. She said she was just a waitress trying to get through her week like anyone else, and she wasn't sure her point of view would matter in a place filled with powerful people who only cared about profits. Her words brought a faint shift in Ethan's expression, something like regret mixed with understanding. He told her that maybe that was exactly why it mattered, because his world was full of people who didn't understand life outside their offices, and someone like her could show him what no report ever could. There was a long pause where neither of them knew what would happen next. Grace looked around the massive room, feeling the weight of her own doubts pressing against the strange sense of purpose forming inside her. Ethan waited quietly, giving her space to think instead of pushing her. And in that silence, the awkwardness between them softened just enough to make room for something new, something that didn't feel like charity or business, but like two opposite lives trying to understand each other. Grace felt the tension in her chest ease when she realized he wasn't trying to impress her or manipulate her, There was sincerity in his face, the kind that didn't come from practice or power, but from someone who had finally recognized a truth he had ignored for far too long. She could sense he wasn't used to being vulnerable, and that alone was enough to make her see him differently. She remembered the tired look he carried when he walked into the diner, the kind that didn't come from being wealthy, but from being worn out in ways money couldn't fix. She took a small breath and told him she would think about it, but she needed to know what he really expected from her. Ethan admitted that he didn't fully know yet, only that he wanted to begin somewhere, and that her view on how people deserve to be treated could help him rebuild parts of his company he now understood were broken. His honesty settled into her mind with a surprising sense of trust she didn't plan on giving him. She realized this wasn't only about him, but about whether she believed small acts of kindness could change something bigger than a night at a diner. Before she could decide, Ethan gently said he hoped she would say yes, not for his reputation or numbers, but because he believed her voice mattered more than she realized. Those words held her in a way she didn't expect, stirring something inside her that made the room feel heavier. She wasn't sure if stepping into his world would lift her life or break it, and that uncertainty lingered in her eyes as she stood to leave. Ethan didn't push her for an answer. He simply watched her walk toward the elevator, with a quiet hope that she might return. Grace held the invitation in her hands, the weight of it warm against her palm as she wondered what accepting it would mean for her future and what refusing it might cost her. And as the elevator doors closed, one question remained open between them, rising like a soft echo that pulled the story forward and refused to fade. Was she ready to help him change a world she never thought she'd be part of? Grace returned to the tall building the next day, carrying the same mix of doubt and hope that followed her home after their first meeting. She didn't know what Ethan expected, but she walked into his office ready to at least listen. Ethan greeted her with a quiet thank you that sounded deeper than politeness, then motioned toward a stack of reports on the table. He admitted he had barely slept because he kept replaying her words from the diner and the office, realizing he had never once looked beyond numbers to see the people affected by them. Grace took a seat, opened the first folder, and began reading aloud stories left by employees who felt invisible inside the company. Some talked about sudden layoffs after years of loyalty, others about workloads that crushed their health, and a few described managers who used fear to control them. Ethan stood still, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on nothing as the truth pressed down on him harder with every sentence. His face tightened each time she paused to breathe, and when she looked up to ask if he wanted her to continue, he nodded, even though the anger and guilt were clearly hitting him at the same time. She wasn't doing this to accuse him, but she also knew he needed to hear it, and that belief kept her voice steady, even when the stories became heavier. Ethan pulled a chair beside her instead of across from her, a small but meaningful sign that he didn't want distance between them anymore. He asked her what she thought these people needed most, and she told him the first thing that came to her mind: someone to believe they matter. The sentence stayed in the air like a weight neither of them could ignore. He stared at the papers again, and for a moment his voice cracked as he admitted he had never imagined the personal pain behind the numbers his company produced. Grace saw the guilt forming in his eyes, but she also saw something new rising behind it, something that looked like a desire to do better instead of just feeling bad. She rested her hand on one of the folders and said quietly that people can handle hard days when they know they're not alone. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind someone releases after holding tension for years, and he thanked her again, this time with a softness she had never heard from him. It wasn't gratitude for information, it was gratitude for honesty. Moments like this tend to hit people in different ways, and anyone listening can probably feel that shift too, that moment when truth stops being about blame and starts being about understanding. It's the kind of feeling that makes people talk in the comments, sharing how they've been treated at work, or how a simple conversation changed the way they see someone. This is where people reading each other's stories remember they're not alone, and that makes this moment between Grace and Ethan feel even more real for everyone here. When the room settled again, Ethan asked Grace what she would do if she were in his position. She hesitated, unsure if he really wanted to hear the unfiltered answer, but his expression told her he did. So she said it gently but truthfully. She would start by fixing the policies that hurt people the most and replace fear with dignity. Ethan rubbed his forehead, processing her words, realizing that the changes she described would require more than a simple memo. They would challenge the leaders he had put in place, the systems he built, and even the version of himself he still carried. Grace noticed the worry in his eyes and told him she understood that change wouldn't be easy, but sometimes the hardest steps were the ones that mattered the most. Her words didn't remove his doubt, but they steadied him, reminding him why he called her there in the first place. By the time Grace stood to leave, Ethan felt something shift inside him, as if everything he once believed about success was being replaced by something far deeper. She held the stack of employee stories close to her chest, planning to review more before their next meeting, and he watched her with the strange mix of hope and fear of a man standing at the edge of a decision that could change his entire life. He thanked her once more, not because he had to, but because he meant it, and she gave him a small smile before stepping out into the hallway. As the door closed, Ethan stayed frozen for a moment, staring at the folders she left on his desk, knowing they held more than words. They held the truth he had avoided for years, and the next step he wasn't sure he was ready to take, leaving one question pressing hard against his chest. How far was he willing to go to fix what he created? Ethan sat across from Grace the following afternoon with a different posture than before, as if the weight of the stories she read to him had forced his shoulders to lower and his guard to slip. He invited her into a smaller meeting room instead of the wide office with its cold view, saying quietly that he wanted a place where things felt less formal. Grace took the chair nearest to him, setting down another stack of documents she had picked up from the HR department, papers full of memories that carried real people's pain. Before opening them, she looked at him and asked if he was ready to hear more. He nodded, though the tightness in his jaw showed he wasn't sure. She began softly, telling him not about strangers this time, but about people she knew, people whose lives were shaped by companies built like his. She mentioned her cousin who was laid off with no warning after giving years of loyalty, and how that loss broke something inside him. She talked about a friend who came home every night, so drained from a job that treated her like a number that she didn't recognize herself anymore. As she spoke, Ethan felt something shifting inside him, because for the first time these weren't statistics or complaints. They were lives connected to someone sitting right in front of him, someone whose kindness had already touched him in ways he still didn't fully understand. Grace's voice didn't shake, but the emotion behind it was strong enough to fill the room. She said she had seen too many people lose parts of themselves to systems that valued profit more than the humans who created it. Ethan stared at the table, his breath growing uneven as each story landed heavier than the last. He whispered that he never imagined the invisible cost behind the decisions he made every day. Grace said quietly that sometimes harm grows in silence when no one looks closely enough. The words struck him like a realization he should have reached long ago. He admitted he had built an empire on efficiency and discipline, believing that was how success worked, never stopping to think how much it demanded from the people who had no power to refuse. His voice carried regret for the first time, thick and honest, and he apologized not just to Grace but to the countless names in the folders between them. She watched his face soften with something close to humility, a quality she never expected to see from someone like him, and it created a small opening in her heart that felt like the beginning of trust. Moments like this always shift the path of a story, the kind of turning point that doesn't look big from the outside, but changes the entire direction of what comes next. And later, when everything unfolds, this moment will echo back, reminding everyone that the first step toward change is finally seeing what was hidden in plain sight. The room felt heavier but calmer as Ethan asked Grace how she kept her compassion alive in a world that often rewarded the opposite. She smiled gently, saying her mom had taught her that kindness wasn't something to give only when it was convenient, but something to protect, even when the world tried to take it away. Ethan swallowed hard, thinking about how far he had drifted from that kind of thinking. He told her he wanted to fix what he had broken, or at least try, and that he needed her guidance to understand how to rebuild something he had never learned to value. Grace looked at him with a softness that wasn't pity, but respect for the courage it took to admit his mistakes. She didn't promise she had all the answers, but she said she was willing to try if he truly meant to change. Ethan nodded slowly, the decision forming inside him like a quiet vow, one he knew would demand more from him than anything he had ever done. As Grace prepared to leave, Ethan stopped her with a question that came from a place of genuine uncertainty. He asked what she thought the first step should be. She paused, thinking of everything she had heard and felt since stepping into his world. She told him the first step wasn't policy or strategy, but listening, really listening, to the people whose voices had been ignored. Ethan held her words close, knowing they were true even if they scared him. Grace smiled softly before walking toward the door, leaving him alone with the echo of the memories she shared. Ethan looked out the window, the city spreading below like a reminder of the empire he built and the responsibility he carried. His heart felt heavy with guilt, but also lighter with a new sense of purpose, as if he finally understood that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others. Yet as he stood there, one question pulled at him with a quiet force he couldn't escape. If he chose to change everything, what would it cost him in the world he once ruled so confidently? Ethan walked into the boardroom with a firmness Grace hadn't seen in him before, but she could also sense the quiet storm moving under his calm expression. The long table was already full, every seat taken by people who had spent years helping him build the empire he now wanted to reshape. Grace stood near the wall, unsure if she even belonged in a room like this, but Ethan had asked her to be there, saying he needed a reminder of why he was doing all of this. When he started talking, his voice was steady, almost gentle, but the words carried a weight that made several board members shift in their chairs. He spoke about the stories he had read, the lives touched by decisions made in this very room, and how dignity needed to become part of the company's foundation. The room grew colder as he laid out his proposed changes, small on paper but huge in practice, aimed at making people feel human again instead of overlooked. Grace watched his hands tighten on the edge of the table as he waited for a response, knowing how much courage it took for him to stand there and admit past mistakes in front of people who never questioned him before. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Then, one by one, the board members reacted not with compassion, but with disbelief and irritation. They accused him of letting emotions cloud his judgment, of letting outsiders influence the stability of the company. One man said these changes would bleed money. Another said Ethan was losing his edge. A woman leaned forward and asked if he even understood the consequences of softening policies that kept the company competitive. Ethan tried to defend the idea that caring for people didn't mean losing strength, but his voice trembled with frustration when they dismissed every point without listening. Grace felt her heart sink as she watched him stand alone in front of the very system he built, realizing the same culture he created was now turning against him with the same sharpness he once admired. Memories flickered through his face. Late nights, pushing numbers, years spent chasing growth, moments when he ignored discomfort because he believed it made him stronger. Now all of it felt like a chain pulling him backward just when he was trying to break free. One of the older board members finally leaned back and spoke with a calmness that felt more dangerous than anger. He said the company couldn't afford a leader who second-guessed the structure that made them powerful. He hinted that if Ethan pushed these reforms any further, they would have no choice but to reevaluate his position as CEO. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. For a moment, Ethan didn't move at all, his jaw locked tight, eyes fixed on that board member as if the words reached straight into his chest. She could almost hear the memory of every decision he had made that helped these people rise to their positions, every sacrifice he offered to build something he thought would define success. Now they were using the same power to threaten him for wanting to change. A heaviness formed in the room, pressing against him until Grace stepped forward, not close enough to stand beside him, but just enough that he could see her presence in his peripheral vision. The small gesture reminded him that he wasn't completely alone, and for the first time she saw gratitude flicker in his eyes amid the frustration. He stood straighter and said he wouldn't back down, though his voice softened in a way that showed the cost of that decision. He told them the company was made of people, not machines, and if they couldn't see the value in protecting those people, then maybe the company had lost something far more important than profit. The words surprised even him as they left his mouth, a truth he had never been brave enough to say until now. The pushback was immediate, louder this time, but Ethan didn't flinch. Grace noticed his hands shaking slightly, the only sign of how deeply the moment affected him. She understood the battle wasn't only about policies, it was about him fighting the version of himself that once agreed with everything the board was saying, and she knew how hard it was to stand against a world you helped shape. The board ended the meeting abruptly, leaving Ethan with a warning that the next discussion would not be as gentle, and the doors shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the room. Ethan stayed still for a long moment, staring at the empty chairs as if trying to make sense of what he had just lost and what he might still lose. Grace stepped closer, placing a hand on the table near his, not touching him, but offering quiet support. He finally looked at her, and she saw fear mix with determination in his eyes. He whispered that he didn't know if he could win against people who believed caring was weakness. Grace told him gently that real strength wasn't measured by fear, but by choosing what was right, even when everything pushed the other way. Her words settled into him like a steady breath after a long storm, but she could still feel the tremor running through him. The meeting had changed something inside him, solidifying his resolve but also revealing the high price he might have to pay. As they left the room, an unspoken question followed them down the hallway, heavy and tense like the air before a lightning strike. Would Ethan sacrifice his entire empire just to protect the dignity he once overlooked? Ethan didn't show up the next morning, not in his office, not in any meeting, not anywhere the company expected him to be. Hours passed before anyone found him sitting alone in a quiet conference room on one of the empty floors, staring at the city through a glass wall like he wasn't sure where his life fit anymore. Grace walked in softly, carrying a folder he'd forgotten the day before, but she stopped when she saw the look on his face. His shoulders were slumped, the confident posture he always carried washed away by the weight of the threat from the board. He said nothing at first, just let out a long breath that sounded like it came from the deepest part of him. Then he told her he couldn't sleep because all he heard in his mind was that he might lose everything if he dared to change anything. He said he felt torn between who he used to be and the person he was slowly becoming, and he didn't know which version of himself he had the strength to defend. Grace listened quietly, letting him speak without interruption, because the doubt in his voice showed he was facing a truth he could no longer hide behind numbers or logic. He talked about the years he spent shaping his empire, building it with strict discipline and cold efficiency, convincing himself those were the tools required to survive in a world that rewarded power. But now that he had seen how many people were hurt along the way, he felt grief for something he could never undo. He didn't know how to carry that guilt, and he didn't know if trying to fix it would destroy everything he had built. Grace stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm, and reminded him that every choice came with a cost, even the choice to stay silent. She said the line that cut through his doubt like a clear bell. Change means choosing who you want to be. Ethan closed his eyes at those words, because he knew they were true in a way nothing else had been lately. He felt the sting of tears he fought back, not from sadness alone, but from the fear of losing the only life he knew. Yet he also knew he couldn't return to the man he was before meeting her. She had shown him a kind of humanity he never let himself see, and now that it lived inside him, pretending it didn't exist felt impossible. He finally admitted he was scared, a confession Grace didn't take lightly. She sat down next to him, not across from him, choosing closeness instead of distance. She told him that fear didn't make him weak, it made him honest. And sometimes honesty was the one thing powerful people forgot they were allowed to feel. He looked at her with an expression that held exhaustion and gratitude, as if her presence grounded him when everything else slipped. She placed the forgotten folder in front of him and said gently that every voice inside it mattered, and so did his. Ethan touched the cover with careful fingers, as if feeling the weight of the responsibility instead of the paper. For a moment the room fell quiet, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind that settles right before a decision takes shape, the kind that pulls a person into the truth they've been avoiding. Grace could see he was right on the edge of choosing his path, but she didn't push him. She simply stayed beside him, letting him know he didn't have to carry all of it alone. He opened the folder slowly and reread the first page, a testimonial from a single mother who had lost her job without warning. His heart tightened with every line, the guilt building until he felt it fill his chest. He whispered that he never meant to hurt anyone, but intention didn't erase impact. Grace nodded softly, telling him that taking responsibility was the first step toward changing how things worked. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw clarity in his eyes instead of confusion. He understood that staying frozen in fear was only another form of harm, another way of letting the old system win. He asked her if she believed he could fix any of it, and she answered with quiet certainty that trying mattered more than pretending it wasn't his problem. Something in him settled at that, like her faith created a small bridge where he could place his first steady step. Moments like these always raise questions for anyone listening, because it's easy to wonder what we would choose if everything we built were suddenly at risk. Would we protect our comfort or try to repair the damage we once ignored? And if you've been following Ethan and Grace's journey, this is the moment to share your thoughts, to drop a comment, and keep walking with us through their story. If you're enjoying how these lives unfold and want more stories like this, subscribing makes sure you never miss the next chapter. As Grace stood to leave, Ethan reached out and touched the folder one more time, the gesture quiet but full of meaning. He said he didn't know exactly what he would do next, but he knew he couldn't turn away anymore. Grace gave him a small, steady smile, the kind that told him she believed he was capable of choosing the right path, even if it scared him. When she walked toward the door, he watched her go with the heavy awareness that the next step he made would define everything: his legacy, his company, and the man he wanted to become. The room felt still around him, but inside his chest, something powerful had begun to move, pulling him toward a choice that would change his life forever. Ethan stayed in the quiet room long after Grace left, staring at the city outside, as if every light reminded him of the people depending on the decisions he still hadn't fully made. The doubt hanging over him slowly tightened into something sharper, something that felt a lot like resolve. By the next morning, he arrived before anyone else, walking through the halls with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He went straight to the records department and demanded full access to every complaint that had crossed the company's systems. Assistants and managers exchanged nervous looks, unsure why the CEO himself was digging through files they usually filtered before he ever saw them. Ethan read each testimony with a sharpened awareness, taking notes, highlighting patterns, stacking folders in a growing pile that painted a picture he could no longer ignore. As the hours passed, his frustration turned into a cold determination, and he drafted new policy outlines on his tablet, with hands that no longer shook with fear, but with impatience to act. When Grace arrived later that morning, he looked up at her with an intensity that surprised her. He said he wanted to put everything on the table, even if the board fought him again. She could feel the change in him, the heaviness replaced with a stubborn fire, but she also sensed the risk pulsing underneath every step he took. Grace joined him at the long table, helping him sort the files into categories based on what needed urgent reform. The room grew warmer as sunlight slipped through the blinds, but the air between them carried tension and focus. She watched him rewrite sections of the employee handbook himself, something executives usually passed to entire teams. Ethan said that if he wanted the company to change, he had to change first, and the words sat between them like a promise. She noted how different he looked now compared to the man who once entered her diner, drenched and irritated. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was taking ownership. Still, she worried about him diving so fast into a fight that might break him. She asked if he had thought about the consequences, not just for the company but for himself. Ethan paused, fingers resting on the edge of a folder, and admitted that he had thought of little else. Losing his position, reshaping his identity, risking everything he built, those thoughts chased him every hour. But now the cost of doing nothing felt much higher. Grace nodded, seeing the truth in him, yet the shadow of uncertainty stayed in her chest. She didn't want him to fall alone if the board pushed back harder this time. They worked side by side well into the afternoon, reading stories of long shifts with no support, of people punished for speaking up, of families struggling after sudden layoffs. Ethan pressed his hand against his forehead, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, but he refused to turn away. Grace gently took one of the pages from his hand and told him he didn't have to fix everything in one day. He let out a breath that shook slightly, then thanked her, his voice softer than before. She reminded him that change wasn't only about policies, it was about learning to listen to voices he once overlooked. Ethan nodded, absorbing her words, realizing how much she had become the anchor he needed inside this storm. He took her advice and focused on one issue at a time, drafting new policies aimed at fairness, security, and dignity. Grace leaned over his shoulder to read a section he revised, and she smiled when she saw he had included protections she once mentioned in passing. That small recognition made her feel seen in a place she never expected to belong. Ethan caught her smile and returned a faint one of his own, a moment of quiet connection amid the chaos of change. Hours later, Ethan printed the drafts and arranged them neatly in a folder marked with his initials. The room fell still as he looked at the stack of documents that symbolized a future built on compassion instead of fear. Grace watched him and noticed how his expression shifted from determination to conflict. She asked what was worrying him now, and he admitted he didn't know how the board would react once they saw how much he planned to change. He feared not for himself this time, but for the people who would suffer if the board fought back by cutting jobs or freezing wages. Grace placed a hand near his on the desk, not touching him but close enough to feel present. She told him that doing the right thing was always a risk, and courage wasn't about being unafraid, but choosing to act anyway. Ethan held her gaze, the two of them sharing a quiet moment where gratitude and fear stood balanced between them. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for change, he was fighting for the meaning of the life he wanted to live. When someone reaches this kind of crossroads, it's worth asking yourself too, if everything you built could crumble by doing what's right, would you still take the step forward? And what would that choice reveal about the person you want to become? Share your thoughts while they're fresh, because moments like this define entire journeys. As dusk settled outside, Ethan closed the folder with a decisive click, and the sound echoed like the beginning of a battle he could no longer delay. Grace sensed the shift and asked quietly if he was ready. He said he didn't know if he was ready, but he was willing, and maybe that was enough to start. The two of them stood there in the dimming light, surrounded by papers that carried the voices of hundreds of people who had waited far too long for someone to listen. The air felt heavy with tension, but underneath it, a thin thread of hope pulsed, fragile but alive. Grace walked with him toward the elevator, and before the doors closed, he glanced at the folder in his hand, aware that the next time he faced the board, everything would come to a breaking point. The elevator began its descent, leaving both of them aware that the choice he made next would define not just his legacy, but the kind of world he wanted his company to stand for. And with that awareness came the quiet fear that doing what was right might cost him everything he had ever known. Ethan walked into the building the next morning with the folder clutched in his hand, ready to face whatever storm the board planned to throw at him. Grace walked beside him, quiet but steady, sensing the tension in every step he took. The moment he reached his office, his assistant hurried toward him with a pale, worried look, handing him a printed memo that had been circulated internally before he even arrived. It announced an emergency board meeting questioning his leadership, hinting that his recent emotional decisions were putting the company at risk. Worse, buried in the middle of the memo written in cold, polished language, was a suggestion that external influence had compromised his judgment. It didn't say Grace's name, but anyone reading it would know exactly who they were talking about. Ethan felt the heat rise in his chest, a sharp mix of anger and disbelief. He had expected resistance, even threats, but dragging Grace into this, using her as a weapon against him, crossed a line he never imagined they would touch. Grace read the memo over his shoulder and stepped back, shaken but trying not to show it. She asked softly if he wanted her to leave, to protect herself from being pulled deeper into something that wasn't her world to begin with. But Ethan shook his head before she even finished the sentence. He told her this wasn't her fault, and that he wouldn't let anyone use her as a shield or a weakness. For the first time since she met him, Grace saw his loyalty not as a distant, silent force, but as something fierce and protective. They walked together to the meeting room, the halls unusually quiet, as if everyone already knew something explosive was about to happen. When the doors opened, the board members sat stiffly, staring at the two of them with eyes full of judgment. They barely waited for Ethan to sit before launching into accusations, saying his sudden concern for employee dignity was naive, irresponsible, and driven by outside influence. One man leaned forward and said in a pointed tone that the company couldn't be shaped by the personal attachments of its CEO. Ethan didn't explode the way Grace expected. Instead, he let the room fall silent before speaking, his voice calm but firm enough to shake the table. He said Grace had nothing to do with his decisions, that she was someone who had shown him what leadership actually meant, and that his conscience, not hers, was guiding every change he wanted to make. A few board members exchanged alarmed glances. None of them expected him to defend her so directly, especially not in public, especially not while risking his own power. He went further, saying it was shameful that the board would even imply she influenced him, when all she did was remind him that people deserved respect. Grace's breath caught as he spoke, because she could feel the weight of loyalty in every word and the risk he was taking by saying it aloud. The room was stunned for a moment, then erupted with louder outrage, accusations now turning into personal attacks. Someone even said that defending a waitress over the company's interests proved he was unfit to lead. At that sentence, Ethan's expression sharpened into something she had never seen from him before: calm, controlled anger mixed with absolute resolve. He told them that leadership wasn't about power or titles, but about choosing to do the right thing, even when people in the room didn't understand it. The air tightened immediately, the way it does right before a storm breaks. One board member slammed a folder shut and warned Ethan that if he continued down this path, they would call for a vote to remove him entirely. Grace felt her stomach twist, hearing the threat spoken so plainly, but Ethan didn't flinch. He said if the cost of protecting people was losing his position, he was ready to face it. Grace's eyes widened. She knew he meant it. And that truth rippled through the room like a shock, because no one at that table expected him to give up the empire he had built just to defend a principle no one believed in, but him. Some moments feel so tense that everyone listening takes the same breath at the same time, the same heartbeat caught between fear and hope. This was one of those moments. And people out there hearing this scene unfold can feel the same knot in their chest, the same mix of pride and worry, because we all know how rare it is to see someone choose integrity over comfort, loyalty over safety. It makes strangers feel connected, as if the room where it happened isn't so far away after all. Silence settled again, heavy and uncertain. The board dismissed them with a promise, one that felt more like a threat, that the final decision would come soon. As Ethan and Grace stepped out of the meeting room, the entire building felt different, colder, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Grace touched Ethan's arm gently, asking if he was all right. He nodded, though his eyes held the weight of what he had just done. He said he didn't know what the board's vote would bring, but he had no regrets about defending her. She looked at him with quiet gratitude, realizing that he was no longer the man who avoided emotions out of fear. He had stepped into a version of himself that cared enough to risk losing everything. As they walked toward the elevator together, the tension didn't fade. It shifted into something sharper, something that told both of them the real fight was only beginning. And when the elevator doors closed, there was a single truth hanging heavily between them. Whatever came next would change everything. Ethan barely slept the night before the final meeting, but when morning came, he stood in front of the mirror and felt something steadier than fear settling in his chest. He straightened his tie, not for appearance but for resolve, telling himself that whatever happened today would define everything that came after. Grace met him in the lobby, her expression calm but worried, sensing the tension running under his silence. She walked beside him toward the conference floor, and each step echoed with the weight of a man walking toward a judgment he could no longer delay. When the boardroom doors opened, every member was already seated, their faces fixed in cold determination. Ethan stepped inside with the folder of reforms in his hand, and Grace remained by the entrance, a quiet witness to the moment she knew would either break him or free him. The chair of the board cleared his throat and said they were ready to hear his defense, though the tone made it clear they doubted he had anything convincing to offer. Ethan didn't sit. He stayed standing, meeting their eyes one by one, before he began speaking with a calm that surprised even him. He laid the documents on the table and explained each reform with clarity, outlining how protecting workers would not only restore trust, but also strengthen the company long-term. Several board members rolled their eyes, others whispered among themselves, and one interrupted him to say dignity didn't pay the bills. Ethan didn't back down. He countered that fear didn't build loyalty, and ignoring people's suffering created losses they never measured on paper. As the room grew more tense, he took a breath and said something he had never admitted publicly, that the culture they built together was broken, and he had helped create a system that rewarded pressure instead of humanity. The admission stirred the room like a struck nerve. A few members froze, shocked he would indict himself as part of the problem. One accused him of destroying the legacy they worked decades to construct. Ethan replied that a legacy built on silence and fear wasn't worth defending. Grace felt her heart tighten as she watched the board fire back at him, every word sharper than the last, every accusation pushing him closer to a line he had never crossed. But he didn't bend. He repeated that dignity was not a weakness, but a foundation, and the company needed to rethink what kind of success it wanted to represent. The chair finally cut through the arguing with a cold, controlled voice. He asked Ethan why they should trust reforms inspired by someone with no business experience, someone he claimed had filled Ethan's mind with guilt and confusion. Ethan's eyes darkened. He said Grace had done nothing but show him what leadership looked like, and if they needed someone to blame, they could blame him alone. The room fell silent, stunned that he once again protected her in front of everyone. Then he pushed further, saying he was willing to put his position on the line for these reforms because he believed the company could no longer operate the way it always had. The tension cracked like glass under heat. Several board members muttered threats about a vote, while others tried to persuade him to reconsider. Ethan refused. He held his ground, his voice steady, even as his fate wavered on the edge. Grace felt the weight of the moment, understanding she was watching a man challenge not only his colleagues, but his own past, tearing away the old version of himself to make room for something new. And sometimes in stories like this, the moment when someone refuses to step back is the moment everything else starts shifting in ways we don't see right away. It's the kind of turning point that doesn't shout, but echoes later, changing every scene that comes after. What's coming will hit harder because of what's happening right here in this room, with every word he chooses. When the chair announced they would proceed with a formal vote to determine his future, the room buzzed with tension. Ethan stood still, letting the weight of those words settle inside him. The vote would decide more than his job. It would decide whether the company accepted its need to change or clung to a system built on fear. Grace watched his hands tighten and release, noticing the quiet tremor running through him. He knew the risk, knew the cost, and yet he didn't retract a single word. The board members began to prepare for the vote, whispering among themselves, each conversation carrying the power to shape the outcome. Ethan walked toward the window for a moment, staring at the busy streets below, as if searching for strength in the movement of people he had once ignored. Grace stepped closer without speaking, offering silent support. He glanced back at her, and in his eyes she saw something new, clarity mixed with acceptance, the look of someone who finally understood what mattered, even if he lost everything else. The board called the room to order again, and Ethan returned to the table, shoulders squared, heart steady. The chair announced the vote would begin in moments, and the members took their seats with the seriousness of people deciding a man's fate. Ethan didn't look away. He didn't speak. He just waited, knowing the next few seconds could change the entire direction of his life. Grace held her breath, watching the room tighten around him like a circle closing in. And as one board member reached for the first ballot, the room went silent, filled with suspense so thick it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Whatever choice they made next would determine whether Ethan's courage would be rewarded or crushed, and the outcome hung in the air like the final note before a storm breaks. Ethan stood in the hallway just outside the boardroom, the echo of their voices still burning in his ears. Grace watched him breathe in slowly, steadying himself after the tension of the vote that never truly finished. The board was preparing to move against him, that much was clear. Their whispers carried enough threat to shake any man who still cared about titles or power. But Ethan felt something inside him shift into place, something that made fear feel small compared to the truth he could no longer deny. He turned toward Grace with a calm that surprised even her and said he wasn't going to wait for them to decide the fate of people who had waited too long for dignity. He said the company belonged to the workers as much as it belonged to any shareholder, and if the board wouldn't stand with them, he would stand alone. Grace saw the decision in his eyes, firm and unstoppable, and she understood that the turning point had already happened inside him long before this moment. What he was about to do wasn't rebellion, it was clarity. It was the man he had become refusing to step back into the shadow of who he once was. He walked straight to his office with Grace right behind him. His assistant tried to stop him to discuss urgent calls from investors, but he raised a hand gently and said there was something more important that needed to come first. He entered his office, closed the door halfway, and sat at his desk with the folders still stacked neatly from the night before. For a moment he stared at them, feeling the weight of every voice inside those pages. Then he opened his laptop, logged into the company's internal system, and drafted a message addressed not to the board, but to every employee in the company. He wrote with honesty, acknowledging the harm caused by a culture he helped create and the reforms he was committed to implementing starting that day. Grace watched as he listed each new policy with clear language and promised that the company would begin rebuilding trust through real action. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to soften the truth. He just told them what was going to change and why. When he finished, he read it again, breathed out slowly, and hit send. The message spread across thousands of screens before the board could even react. Minutes later, notifications burst through the building. Phones buzzed, computers pinged, and whispers rose like a wave rolling through floor after floor. Ethan stepped onto the balcony outside his office, needing air as the reality of what he had done settled over him. Grace joined him quietly, and they both watched employees gather in small groups below, reading the announcement aloud to each other. Some covered their mouths, shocked. Some wiped tears. Some smiled with disbelief, as if they had been waiting their entire careers to hear a leader speak this way. Others simply stood still, taking in the weight of change that felt impossible only days ago. Ethan's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the strange, humbling sensation of witnessing what real leadership looked like when stripped of ego and profit. Grace saw the way his hands trembled just slightly and gently told him that this was the moment everything turned. He nodded, unable to speak, because he knew he had crossed a line he could never go back from. Downstairs, word began to reach media outlets that the CEO had bypassed his board to announce sweeping reforms that prioritized worker dignity. Reporters gathered at the building's entrance. Live broadcasts began, capturing employees stepping forward to share their reactions. Some spoke about years of feeling invisible. Others mentioned deep gratitude that someone finally acknowledged what they had lived through. A few even explained how Grace herself had inspired hope before they ever knew her name, telling stories of nights at the diner when her kindness helped them through hard moments. Ethan listened as the crowd grew louder, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt since before he became a billionaire. Connection, purpose, humanity. And Grace, standing next to him, realized he wasn't doing this to save his position. He was doing it because he had already found something more valuable than power. The board stormed into his office minutes later, furious, demanding explanations, accusing him of violating procedure, threatening legal action. But Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped back inside, facing them with the steady resolve of someone who had already accepted the consequences. He told them the decision was made, and that if they wanted to remove him, they were free to try. But they would have to do it in front of employees who finally saw hope, and in front of a public that was watching closely. His words landed like stones in the room, heavy and undeniable. Grace stayed silent near the window, seeing how the board faltered, not because of his power, but because his conviction left no room for doubt. He wasn't acting out of impulse. He wasn't confused. He wasn't manipulated. He was choosing the kind of leader he wanted to be.